Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The first snowfall of the season drifted lazily over the city, a soft, white veil that barely concealed the harsh realities of those left out in the cold. New York streets were alive with the usual chaos: honking cabs, hurried footsteps, and muffled conversations of people wrapped in thick coats, rushing to their warm homes. But amidst the neon lights and luxury storefronts, Evelyn Grace sat curled against the wall of a boarded-up store, her fingers clenched around the frayed edges of her oversized coat. The fabric was so thin that the winter wind cut straight through it, chilling her to the bone. She barely noticed anymore. Hunger and exhaustion had long numbed her to discomfort. Beside her, her mother, Margaret, lay curled on her side, her breathing ragged. Evelyn's heart clenched at the sound. It had gotten worse. The coughing fits came more often now, each one leaving her mother weaker, paler. She was running out of time. Evelyn had long since stopped crying. Tears were a luxury. She had learned to survive in silence, to make herself small, invisible. The world wasn't kind to girls like her, the ones who had nothing. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was going to change everything. Her fingers twitched against her lap as she watched the doors of an upscale restaurant swing open across the street. From inside, laughter spilled onto the sidewalk, accompanied by the rich aroma of food she could almost taste. She knew better than to stare too long. Hope was dangerous when you had nothing. But something caught her eye. A sleek black limousine glided to a stop in front of the restaurant. The driver stepped out, swiftly moving to open the door, and out stepped a man. Tall, impeccably dressed. His coat alone looked like it cost more than everything Evelyn had ever owned. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his sharp jawline tense as he glanced at his phone. He looked untouchable, like someone who didn't have to worry about anything, like someone who had never felt hunger, never spent a night shivering under a thin blanket, never had to beg strangers for spare change just to survive. But there was something else about him. Something behind his cold exterior, an edge of something Evelyn couldn't quite name. Her breath hitched. This was her chance. She didn't know what she was about to do. It wasn't planned. But desperation made people do wild things, and she was more desperate than she had ever been. Without thinking, she scrambled to her feet, her limbs stiff from the cold, and darted forward. She weaved through the moving bodies, her small frame unnoticed by the city that never stopped moving. The man was turning away, walking toward the restaurant's entrance. She couldn't let him leave. "Sir, wait." Her voice cut through the noise, startling even herself. The man, Nathaniel West, stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing as he turned in her direction. His piercing gaze landed on her, scanning her from head to toe. Evelyn knew how she looked. Tattered clothes, thin face, hair tangled from nights spent on the streets. She saw the flicker of recognition in his expression. He thought she was just another beggar, someone easily ignored. But she wasn't. Not tonight. "Please," she said, breathless, clutching the hem of her coat. "I need to talk to you." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He exhaled through his nose, his patience already wearing thin. "I don't carry cash," he said curtly, turning away. "It's not about money," Evelyn shot back, stepping closer. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to keep going. "I need you to marry me." The words sounded absurd the moment they left her lips. For a second, the world around her seemed to pause. Nathaniel turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me." Evelyn swallowed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You heard me. I need you to marry me." A few pedestrians glanced their way, but Nathaniel didn't seem to care. He stared at her as if trying to make sense of what he had just heard. "That's a bold demand," he said, his voice laced with dry amusement. "It's not a joke," Evelyn said, standing her ground. "If you marry me, just for one day, I'll be your princess, and you'll be my prince. And you can help my mom. She's sick." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "We don't have anywhere to go. She won't make it through the winter. But you can change that." Nathaniel's fingers twitched at his sides. His expression darkened, as if something in her words had struck a nerve. He stole a glance past her, his gaze landing on Margaret, still curled up against the cold. For a moment, something flashed in his eyes, something almost like recognition. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I can't help you," he said firmly, stepping back. "I'm sorry." Evelyn's stomach clenched. She had expected rejection, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Still, she couldn't give up. She reached out, grabbing the sleeve of his coat before he could turn away. "Please," she whispered, "just listen." Nathaniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if trying to shake off the unease creeping into his chest. "This is crazy," he thought. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the dinner meeting he was supposed to attend. Then another buzz, a message from his assistant. "Meeting postponed." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. His gaze flickered back to Evelyn. He wasn't sure what he was doing. But against all logic, he crouched down to meet her gaze. "All right," he said. "I'm listening." Evelyn's breath hitched. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a little magic left in the world. A deal with destiny. Nathaniel West had always been a man who thrived on control. His life was measured, structured, and devoid of unnecessary entanglements. Every move he made was calculated, every decision backed by reason and logic. So why, in the middle of a freezing New York night, was he standing on the sidewalk, staring into the desperate eyes of an 18-year-old beggar girl who had just asked him to marry her? It didn't make sense. Nathaniel had spent his entire career building walls between himself and the world, ensuring that emotions never dictated his choices. But there was something about this girl, Evelyn Grace, that refused to be ignored. The cold wind howled down the street, carrying with it the sounds of a city too busy to care. But for Nathaniel, time had slowed. He could feel the weight of her words pressing against him. She needed help, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he was considering giving it. "Let's get you and your mother out of the cold first," he muttered, glancing past Evelyn toward the frail woman huddled against the wall. Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. Did he just agree? She could barely process it, but she didn't hesitate. She spun on her heels, rushing back to her mother's side. "Mom," she whispered, gently shaking Margaret's shoulder. "We have to go." Margaret stirred, her face pale and drawn, her body barely responding. Evelyn's heart squeezed in fear, but Nathaniel was already beside her. Without a word, he crouched down and scooped Margaret into his arms effortlessly. Evelyn gasped. She wasn't used to kindness, let alone from a stranger, and certainly not from a man like him. Rich, powerful, untouchable. Nathaniel didn't look at her. He simply turned and started walking toward his waiting limousine, as if he had already made up his mind. Evelyn hesitated only for a second before hurrying after him. The limousine was warm, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Margaret, too weak to protest, was laid across the plush seats. Evelyn sat beside her, her hands gripping her mother's frail fingers as if afraid she would disappear. Across from them, Nathaniel sat in silence, his piercing gaze flickering between the two of them. Finally, he spoke. "You're asking me to do something impossible," he said, his voice steady but unreadable. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I'm asking you to save my mother." Nathaniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "You think marriage is the answer?" His voice was laced with skepticism, but there was no cruelty in it. Evelyn bit her lip, struggling to explain. "I didn't think about it," she admitted. I saw you, and you looked like someone who could help. And people listen to married couples, right? I figured, Maybe if I was your wife, even for a day, you'd have to care. Nathaniel scoffed, shaking his head. That's not how the world works. Evelyn's stomach twisted, but she lifted her chin. Then how does it work? She challenged. Because as far as I can tell, the world only works for people like you. People who have power. People who have money. Her voice trembled, but she refused to back down. For people like me, the world is a locked door, and the only way to survive is to beg for a key. Nathaniel stilled. He had no idea why her words struck him like a blade, but they did. Maybe because once, long ago, he had been the one locked outside. Evelyn took a deep breath. If you won't marry me, she said quietly, at least tell me what you will do. Nathaniel leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, he spoke. I will pay for your mother's treatment, he said. She'll get the best doctors, the best care. I'll make sure of it. Evelyn's lips parted in shock. You mean it? I don't make promises I don't keep, Nathaniel replied. Tears burned at the back of Evelyn's eyes. After months of struggling, of fighting against a world that didn't care, someone was finally willing to help. But then Nathaniel added something that made her stomach drop. There's a condition. Evelyn's breath hitched. What kind of condition? Nathaniel's gaze locked onto hers, unreadable but firm. You wanted a marriage. Fine. You'll have one. Evelyn blinked. What? I'll marry you, he said, as if the words weren't completely insane. But not for one day. The air in the limousine seemed to thin. Evelyn could barely breathe. You will stay with me, Nathaniel continued. For 1 year. The world tilted beneath her. 1 year. That's the deal, Nathaniel said. Your mother gets treatment, you get security, and in return, you live in my world, under my rules. Evelyn's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. This wasn't what she had asked for. She had been desperate, reckless, but she had never imagined he would actually agree. A year. Living with a stranger, a man like Nathaniel West. She swallowed, glancing at her mother. Margaret needed help. She didn't have time to hesitate. But what would this deal cost her? Nathaniel watched her carefully, as if he could see the war raging inside her. The choice is yours, he said. But decide now, because once you said yes, there's no backing out. Evelyn's fingers trembled as they clutched her mother's hand. This was her moment, the moment that would change everything. She had no idea if she was making a mistake, but she had no other choice. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. I'll do it. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes shifted. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Then it's settled, he said, dialing a number. Evelyn heard him utter 3 words that sealed her fate. Prepare the papers. The deal that changed everything. Evelyn barely slept that night. She lay curled on the enormous bed in the luxurious hotel suite Nathaniel had arranged for them, staring at the crystal chandelier above her. The mattress was softer than anything she had ever imagined, the sheets like silk against her skin. But sleep refused to come. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. 1 year. She had agreed to marry a man she had just met for an entire year. Her heart twisted in fear, but there was no turning back now. Her mother's life depended on this deal. Beside her, Margaret lay motionless, her breathing shallow but steady. The doctor had visited earlier, confirming that her condition was critical but treatable if she received the right care. That care, Evelyn knew, was only possible because of Nathaniel West. She turned onto her side, gripping the blankets tightly. Why had he agreed? Why would a man like him, a man with power, money, and everything at his fingertips, tie himself to someone like her? She didn't understand it, and it scared her. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across the suite. Evelyn forced herself up, wincing as stiffness spread through her limbs. She had spent too many nights on the streets to be used to comfort. The warmth of the room, the soft carpet beneath her bare feet, it all felt surreal. She moved carefully, checking on her mother before stepping out into the living area of the suite. Nathaniel was already awake, standing by the window with his phone pressed to his ear. He was dressed in another crisp suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. He looked like he belonged in a world of wealth and power, a world Evelyn had never known. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure if she should interrupt. That's when she heard his voice. No mistakes. The wedding needs to be finalized within the next 3 days. Evelyn's breath caught. 3 days. That was all the time she had before her life changed forever. She took an unconscious step back, but the slight movement made the floor creak. Nathaniel turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto her instantly. She froze. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just studied her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Then he ended the call and placed his phone on the table. "You're awake," he said simply. Evelyn swallowed. "Yeah." There was another silence before he gestured to the dining table. "You should eat." She hadn't even noticed the breakfast spread laid out. Fresh fruit, pastries, eggs, toast, steaming cups of coffee and tea. Her stomach clenched painfully at the sight of it. She had spent months starving on the streets. Now, suddenly, she had more food than she knew what to do with. Tentatively, she sat down, her fingers shaking as she reached for a piece of toast. Nathaniel sat across from her, watching but saying nothing. It was unnerving. She felt like a puzzle he was trying to figure out. Finally, she broke the silence. "You're really doing this?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "Yes. But why?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his coffee cup, taking a slow sip before setting it down. "I have my reasons." Evelyn frowned. That wasn't an answer. But she knew better than to push. Instead, she dropped her gaze to her plate, taking small bites of toast and fruit, her body still half convinced this was a dream she would wake up from. Minutes passed in silence before Nathaniel spoke again. "You need a dress." She looked up, startled. "What?" "For the wedding," he said. "It has to look real." Evelyn's stomach twisted. It was really happening. She had agreed to this deal, but the reality of it was finally sinking in. A wedding. With a man she didn't know. Her hands clenched in her lap. "I've arranged for a stylist to take you shopping today," Nathaniel continued. "You'll have whatever you need." Evelyn forced herself to nod. This was for her mother. That was the only thought that kept her steady. The shopping trip. A few hours later, Evelyn found herself standing in the middle of an upscale boutique, surrounded by racks of elegant gowns she had only ever seen in magazines. It felt like stepping into another universe. A personal stylist flitted around her, holding up dresses, measuring fabrics, muttering about color palettes and silhouettes. Evelyn barely understood half of it. She felt out of place, completely and utterly out of place. "This one," the stylist finally announced, holding up a gown. It was breathtaking. Ivory silk with delicate lace detailing, its flowing skirt shimmering under the boutique's golden lights. It looked like something a princess would wear. Evelyn's breath caught. "Try it on," the stylist urged, ushering her toward the dressing room. She obeyed in a daze, stepping into the gown with the help of an assistant. The fabric slid over her skin, cool and weightless. When she turned to the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked different. Not like a beggar girl. Not like someone who had spent years fighting to survive. She looked like someone who belonged in a world she had never dared to dream of. The door to the dressing room opened slightly. "Are you ready?" Evelyn hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped out. Nathaniel was waiting. He stood near the entrance of the boutique, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable as he glanced up at her. For a moment, everything went still. His gaze swept over her, lingering for just a second too long before he blinked and turned away. "It'll do," he said briskly. The stylist clapped her hands in delight. "Perfect choice, Miss Grace. Absolutely stunning." Evelyn barely heard her. Her heart was pounding. She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the fact that Nathaniel had looked at her like she was something other than a problem to solve. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in years, she felt seen. Or maybe it was the terrifying realization that she was about to step into a world she didn't understand, bound to a man who was still a mystery. The wedding was happening, and there was no turning back. The wedding that wasn't meant to be. The wedding was happening. Evelyn had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of her new room in Nathaniel's estate, her fingers clutching the silk sheets beneath her. Sleep had never come. Because how could she sleep knowing that by the end of the day, she would be legally bound to a man she had met just days ago? It still didn't feel real. Even when the morning sun broke through the heavy curtains, even when the estate buzzed with activity, staff preparing, deliveries arriving, florists filling the halls with white roses, none of it felt real. Evelyn sat stiffly in front of the vanity mirror as a team of stylists worked around her, curling her hair, applying light makeup, adjusting her dress. "You're lucky," one of them said, smiling as she fastened a delicate diamond necklace around Evelyn's throat. "Mr. West is a very powerful man. Marrying him means you'll never have to struggle again." Evelyn swallowed hard, but didn't respond. Lucky. Was that what this was? She was trading one struggle for another. She wasn't naive enough to think that marrying Nathaniel West would suddenly solve all of her problems. Her mother was still sick. Their past hadn't disappeared. And as much as she wanted to believe this was just a business arrangement, something told her that nothing was ever that simple. The stylists finished their work, stepping back with satisfied smiles. Evelyn turned to the mirror and froze. The girl staring back at her was a stranger. The dress fit her perfectly, its ivory silk hugging her frame. Her hair cascaded in soft waves, her makeup subtle but polished. For the first time in her life, she looked like she belonged in this world. But she didn't, and she never would. The ceremony. The chapel was small but breathtaking. White roses lined the pews, their scent filling the air. Golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over the marble floors, and the soft notes of a piano played in the background. Only a handful of people were in attendance. Nathaniel had insisted on keeping the ceremony private. No press. No unnecessary guests. Just the two of them, his lawyer and a judge. Evelyn stood at the entrance, her hands trembling as she clutched the bouquet. Her heart was pounding so loudly, she thought it might drown out the music. Then, the doors opened. Nathaniel stood at the altar, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. He was watching her. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze was steady, piercing. Evelyn took a shaky breath and stepped forward. One step, then another. With every step she took, the reality of the situation sank deeper. This was it. She was about to marry a man she barely knew. She forced herself to keep walking, even as the fear coiled in her stomach, like a snake. Then, finally, she reached him. Nathaniel extended his hand. Evelyn hesitated, just for a second. Then, with trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, steady. She expected him to look away, to avoid her gaze. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in slightly and whispered, "Breathe." Evelyn blinked up at him, surprised. For the first time since this entire ordeal had started, he didn't sound like a businessman sealing a deal. He sounded human. She let out a shaky breath. And then, the judge began to speak. The shocking revelation. The ceremony went by in a blur. Vows were exchanged, rings were slipped onto fingers, words were spoken. Evelyn barely heard any of it. Her mind was spinning. She had spent so long fighting to survive that she had never once imagined what it would feel like to be a bride. And now, standing here, with Nathaniel's hand wrapped around hers, she wasn't sure what to feel. Then the moment came. The judge turned to her. "Do you, Evelyn Grace, take Nathaniel West to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The words hung in the air. Evelyn's throat tightened. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. "I do," she whispered. The judge nodded, then turned to Nathaniel. "And do you, Nathaniel West, take Evelyn Grace to be your lawfully wedded wife?" There was a pause. A long pause. Evelyn's breath caught. Nathaniel wasn't answering. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable. Seconds ticked by. Her heart pounded harder. Was he about to change his mind? But then, finally, he spoke. "I do." Relief flooded Evelyn's body, but it was short-lived. Because just as the judge prepared to finalize the ceremony, a loud voice echoed through the chapel. "Stop the wedding." The room fell into stunned silence. Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. A woman stood at the entrance of the chapel, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Nathaniel's entire body tensed beside her. Evelyn's hands clenched around her bouquet. Who was she? And why did she look like she had just seen a ghost? The woman stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You can't marry her." Evelyn's blood ran cold. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "And why is that?" The woman's gaze flickered to Evelyn, then to Nathaniel. And then, finally, she whispered the words that changed everything. "Because she's already married." The truth that changed everything. Silence fell over the chapel. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. Already married. Her mind went blank. Her hands trembled around the bouquet, her knuckles turning white. She turned to Nathaniel, expecting him to demand an explanation, to end this farce right then and there. But he didn't. His face remained unreadable, his sharp blue eyes locked onto the woman who had just shattered the moment. Evelyn swallowed hard and forced her voice to work. What did you just say?" The woman, who looked no older than 30, took a hesitant step forward. Her expression was conflicted, filled with hesitation and something almost like regret. "You can't marry her," she repeated, her voice softer now. "Because she's already married." Evelyn shook her head, her body trembling. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I've never been married. I don't even know you." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "No," she said, "but I know you." Nathaniel, who had been eerily quiet until now, finally spoke. "Who are you?" His voice was cold, calculated, a warning wrapped in a question. The woman hesitated before answering. "My name is Claire Donovan. I work for the New York Child Services." The word sent a jolt through Evelyn's spine. Child Services. The very system that had failed her. The system that had taken her from one shelter to another, never caring where she ended up, never giving her a real home. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his entire demeanor shifted, his posture stiffening like a man preparing for a fight. What does Child Services have to do with this wedding? Claire sighed, rubbing her temples as if she was dreading what came next. Evelyn Grace isn't her real name. Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. "What?" she choked out. Claire turned to her, her expression softening. "I didn't recognize you at first," she admitted. "But when I saw the announcement of your marriage to Nathaniel West, I had to check the records again." Nathaniel's patience was running thin. "Get to the point," he snapped. Claire nodded. Evelyn Grace was reported missing when she was only 6 years old. Evelyn's body went numb. A missing person. She had no memory of that. No recollection of ever belonging anywhere before her life on the streets. Nathaniel, however, was laser-focused. "And the marriage?" he pressed. Claire hesitated. When Evelyn disappeared, she was already promised an illegal guardianship contract, one that was signed in her name before she was even old enough to understand it. That contract binds her to a legal marriage. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. "That's impossible," she whispered. Claire's gaze softened. "It was arranged by your birth parents." Evelyn felt like she was drowning. My birth parents. The words felt foreign on her tongue. She had no memory of them. Not even the faintest recollection of a mother's face or a father's voice. They were wealthy, Claire continued. Part of an old money family that followed traditions most of us can't even begin to understand. She exhaled. When you were 6 years old, they arranged for you to be betrothed. The contract wasn't public, but it was real. And when they died, she trailed off, regret flashing in her eyes. You were lost, fell through the cracks. The world forgot about you. Evelyn couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. Nathaniel's grip on her hand tightened. She didn't even realize she had been gripping onto him, as if he was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. His voice was dangerously quiet. Who is she married to? Claire hesitated. Then she pulled out a folder. A thick file of documents. She flipped through the pages, found the one she was looking for, and held it up for them to see. Evelyn's eyes landed on a name. A name she had never seen before. A name that meant nothing to her. But the moment Nathaniel saw it, something dark flashed across his face. Because he knew the name. James Harrington. Nathaniel inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching at his side. This isn't a coincidence, he muttered under his breath. Evelyn looked up at him, confused. Do you know him? Nathaniel's jaw clenched. Yes. Evelyn swallowed, her chest tightening. Who is he? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. Nathaniel's gaze flickered with something she couldn't quite name. And then, in a voice so calm it sent a chill through the room, he answered, He's my greatest enemy. The truth unraveled. The wedding never finished. The moment Claire revealed the truth, the ceremony was halted, and Evelyn was rushed back to Nathaniel's estate under strict security. For hours she sat in silence, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She wasn't just a beggar girl. She wasn't just some nameless street orphan. She had a past, a family, a contract that had bound her before she was even old enough to understand what love was. And now, she was tangled in something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Nathaniel sat across from her in his office, his hands steepled together as he studied her. Tell me the truth, Evelyn whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Who is James Harrington? Nathaniel's gaze darkened. He's the man who tried to destroy me. Evelyn's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about power, about wealth, about a game that had been played long before she had even stepped into this world. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, then looked her dead in the eyes. We have two choices, he said. You can walk away, start over, disappear again. Evelyn's throat tightened. And the second choice. Nathaniel leaned forward. We fight. Evelyn's breath caught. If James finds out who you are, Nathaniel continued, he won't just let you go. He will claim you. He will use you. And if he succeeds, you'll never have a say in your own life again. Evelyn swallowed hard. She had spent her entire life running, surviving, scraping by on the edges of a world that never cared. She had never fought for anything before. But maybe it was time to start. Her fingers tightened around the arms of her chair. What do we do? She asked. Nathaniel's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smirk. We get married, he said. For real this time. Evelyn's pulse pounded. She didn't know what scared her more. The war that was coming, or the fact that for the first time in her life, she was about to step into it willingly. A choice that changed everything. Evelyn sat in silence, staring at the man across from her. Nathaniel West, billionaire, strategist, a man she had once thought untouchable, had just proposed the unthinkable. A real marriage. Not for a day, not as a contract, but as a weapon, a shield against a man she had never met, a man whose name was now stitched into the very fabric of her existence. James Harrington, her supposed husband. her supposed fate. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. For so long, she had been powerless, tossed around by a world that didn't care whether she lived or died. But now she had a choice. She could disappear, leave everything behind, let the past consume her like it had always threatened to. Or she could fight. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She looked up, meeting Nathaniel's unwavering gaze. His patience was endless, but beneath the surface she saw something else. Hope, not just for her. For himself. Maybe he had spent his whole life fighting battles alone. Maybe, just like her, he had once been lost. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Evelyn took a slow, steady breath. Then she stood. Nathaniel followed her movement, watching her carefully, as if waiting for her to break. She didn't. Instead, she held out her hand. "Okay," she said, voice steady. "Let's do this." Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He reached forward, grasping her hand firmly in his. And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't about a contract. This wasn't about a name. This was about her. Taking back her life. Fighting for her own future. Becoming someone more than a girl left behind. Nathaniel's grip tightened slightly, his eyes glinting with something almost unreadable. "Then let's make history," he murmured. Evelyn exhaled, the weight on her chest lifting for the first time in years. She didn't know what lay ahead. She didn't know what battles they would have to fight, what storms would come. But she knew one thing. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't waiting for a prince to save her. She was stepping into the fire. And this time, she was ready. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.